As I make this video, there has again been something of a lull in the fighting in Ukraine, though it's unlikely to last very long, and no doubt by the time you're watching this video, things will have changed and we'll be seeing more military activity on the various front lines. Yesterday, however, was quite a busy day, with Ukrainian attacks, specifically and principally, it seems, in the Bakhmut area, which were unsuccessful, and apparently heavy fighting around Avdiivka, with information from the Russian side, which, by the way, has been confirmed, that a Ukrainian platoon, I understand that would number around 20 to 30 men, apparently surrendering en masse to the Russians at the command of their commanding officer. He apparently took the decision that continuing to fight in the situation, the position that they were in, was hopeless, and he ordered the entire unit to surrender, and they did. And they came over to the Russians, bringing two of their Soviet-era BMP infantry fighting vehicles with them. Anyway, that was in Avdiivka. There was also very, very heavy fighting yesterday in this area known as the Vremivka ledge, the area where the Ukrainians managed to capture 4 villages the previous night. I've explained the circumstances in which this happened, how the Russian surveillance systems were obscured for a time by the rain, and how the Ukrainians seized the chance to drive up the one asphalt road in this area and occupy these 4 villages, though one of these villages, as I've said previously, is basically, so far as I can see, little more than a farm. This continues to be referenced, by the way, in the media, at least in Britain. They still talk about these 4 villages as being under Ukrainian control, though early yesterday morning, with the rain clearing and with daylight, the Russians went on the counterattack. Apparently a division, the 127th motorized rifle division of the Russian army, participated in this attack. And as I discussed yesterday, it's now confirmed that they managed to recapture this somewhat larger village of Mercouris yesterday, and it seems that they've pushed the Ukrainians out of several, though not all, of the villages that the Ukrainians have captured. I'm not sure exactly how many of these villages the Ukrainians still control, but let's say it's 2 or perhaps 3. But anyway, there's no doubt, it seems, that they've been rolled back a certain distance. And as I discussed yesterday, these are very small places, deserted villages, and hardly places of any great political, economic, or military significance. It's also been suggested, and I think this is almost certainly true, that attacking in this particular area has put the Ukrainians in a location where they are heavily exposed to fire from the Russian artillery on the higher ground, and where to some extent they find themselves in a kind of semicircle with Russian guns to the east and west and south of them. And there are reports, very difficult to confirm as always, but probably true, that the Ukrainians have suffered extremely heavy losses in all of this fighting. Now, this incident, as I said yesterday, has attracted far too much attention, a disproportionate amount of attention, and indeed the value of this fighting in the Vremivka ledge is questionable. And there's been a tweet, which I think sums it up fairly well, by somebody called Fennec Radar. I have no idea who this person is, but he does seem to be somebody who has some understanding of these matters, military understanding of these matters. And he says, I really wonder about the logic of attacking this salient, this area, the Vremivka ledge, with the forces Ukrainians have. Even if they manage to capture it, there is only a single paved road along a river valley that leads to no major transport hubs. Like, where do you go if you capture it? And Valterson, who is, as I said, a military person, he's served in the Swedish military and has an understanding of these things far superior to my own. He makes exactly the same point. He says that the Russians have indeed recaptured some of this territory, but he questions the logic of what exactly it is that the Ukrainians are trying to achieve here. And Valterson has made the point that he is also somewhat baffled by Ukrainian moves. Why are they giving so much attention to this fight in this particular location? When he says, and he specifically refers to Fennec's points, my take is the same. It's a good consolation prize to show the world that the Ukrainian armed forces have had some success during the counter-offensive if they failed elsewhere. The Vremivka salient is an easy target, lightly defended by the Russian military, but bad supply roads and with Ukrainian forces on two sides, west and the north. But its eventual capture will not change anything else other than level the front line for both sides. The front line will then be, as everywhere else on the southern front, with the main Russian defense line 10 kilometers behind the new front line and the same distance to the Sea of Azov as elsewhere. And I think this is all entirely correct, and it, as I said, does seem to me a very strange situation. And anyway, it does seem all rather an over focus on a rather obscure area of the battlefields. And incidentally, the same point, somewhat differently, appears to have been made by the New York Times. The New York Times says that Ukraine has made some minor gains, but it has failed to make any sort of breakthrough in these first 10 days or so of the offensive, but it has taken severe losses. Its attacks against Russian trenches, bunkers, minefields, gun emplacements are likely to have taken a heavy toll, and losses of both troops and advanced weapons newly supplied to Kiev have been confirmed. So there we go. A lot of effort and energy to achieve so far rather little. In fact, nothing, if truth be said, of any consequence whatsoever. Now, there is one story that is circulating and which was reported today, and that is that a Russian general has been killed in this fighting. And there was actually some reports yesterday that Ukrainian communications were overheard in this area of the Vremivka salient, in which the Ukrainians were apparently given orders to either kill or capture someone, presumably some important Russian officer. And today, there's been reports that a Russian general, Major General Sergei Goryachev, the Chief of Staff of the 35th Combined Arms Army, was killed yesterday in the fighting. Well, I haven't seen any confirmation of that from the Russian Defense Ministry. It's been suggested that some Russian bloggers are reporting this, but I haven't seen any of the important ones do so. We'll just have to wait and see. But to reiterate again, it is not unusual for Russian officers to expose themselves to danger by joining their soldiers on the front lines. That does run risks of death or capture. A Russian general would not want to be captured and would probably prefer death, if one has to say it as bluntly as that. So it's not impossible that this has happened. But as of now, I have seen no evidence of this at all. Anyway, so a lot of fighting on the Vremivka ledge, nothing, as I said, of any real importance happening. Perhaps a Russian general has been killed, but Russia has no shortage of generals and competent staff officers, and no doubt he will be replaced if he has indeed been killed, as some reports are claiming. There's been lots of reports, by the way, of Russian generals having been killed over the course of this fighting. But most of those, I would reiterate, I would stress, have been wrong. In some cases, we know definitely wrong, because we've seen instances of Russian generals active and engaged long after they're supposed to have been killed. But anyway, I'm not going to say more about this. This is a speculative report. I can't discuss it further. But so far, to the extent that there's been any fighting at all, or rather to the extent that there was actually quite heavy fighting yesterday, it was in the Vremivka ledge. The Russians regained some ground, Ukrainians still hold some ground, but overall nothing of any importance has been achieved by either side there. Now, having said that, when I say nothing of any importance has been achieved, what the Russians are doing is that they are using these battles in advance of the main fortified lines to carry out attrition of Ukrainian forces, and they seem to be doing that fairly effectively. Now, there's been a report, I think it is in Agence France Presse, that 15%, that's around 16 vehicles, 15% of the total number of Bradley infantry fighting vehicles donated to Ukraine have now been destroyed in the fighting. And that's already a very high loss rate after just a week of basically banging on the Russian lines in the grey zone and achieving nothing of significance. And it's not clear how many Leopard 2s, German-supplied Leopard 2 tanks, have been destroyed. But as I said in my program yesterday, it looks to be at least a dozen, and it could be more than that. And apparently the Ukrainians are now becoming alarmed by the rate of loss of these Leopard 2s, because the former Ukrainian ambassador to Germany, Mr. Melnik, who is now Deputy Foreign Minister, has made further urgent demands to Germany for replacements of these Leopard 2 tanks. He said that Germany has 300 Leopard 2s, that they can easily supply more Leopard 2s to Ukraine, and that doing so would not impact significantly on Germany's defence preparedness, something, by the way, which the German army vigorously disputes. But anyway, Mr. Melnik has been saying this. The German Defense Minister Boris Pistorius has responded that Germany cannot replace every Leopard 2 that Ukraine loses, one for one, which is, I think, a polite way of saying no. Instead, he said that Ukraine will eventually receive Leopard 1 tanks and that it will get 100 of them eventually, and that it must basically be satisfied with those. Now, as I've discussed many times, the Leopard 1 tank is a tank designed in the 50s, operated by the German military in the 60s and 70s. In its day, it was a highly regarded tank. It has very thin armour, a good gun and very advanced optics, but it is arguably a less effective tank than the Soviet T-62 of the same period, which has a more powerful gun and heavier armour, though probably less effective optics. So the Leopard 1 is no substitute for the Leopard 2. If the Leopard 2 can be destroyed, there is no doubt at all that the Russians will have little difficulty destroying Leopard 1s, which, as I said, have thinner armour and weaker protection. And in fact, my sense is that the Leopard 1 tank in this kind of conflict zone is actually probably survivable to only marginally a greater extent than the French AMX 10RC wheeled vehicles, sometimes referred to as wheeled tanks, which the Russians also seem to be having no problem destroying because of their relatively thin armour. So anyway, Boris Pistorius has said no. And there's been a story, a rumour, that some days ago President Zelensky telephoned the United States and spoke to General Milley and apparently begged for the Ukrainian offensive to be called off. He said that the losses were too high to sustain the offensive, and he said instead that what Ukraine really needs are more Patriot missiles and more F-16s and more weapons altogether. And according to the reports, Milley became very angry with Zelensky, as did other officials who were American officials who were in on the call, and they basically insisted that the offensive must be continued with the weapons that Ukraine already has. Now, I'm not absolutely convinced that this is a reliable report. You can find an interesting discussion of it by Larry Johnson on his excellent blog, Sonar 21. Larry Johnson also points out that this is, to some extent, uncertain how accurate this report is, and this could be disinformation. But it's not inherently implausible. Ukrainians have never, it seemed to me, been especially keen on launching this offensive, and they've always been demanding more and more weapons. And it's quite clear to me, and it's been made clear, it's clear to many people by now, that it is the West, the Western powers, who have been insisting that Ukraine carry out this offensive. And Larry Johnson asks, why was General Milley so angry in response to President Zelensky's request that the offensive be called off? Well, I'm going to suggest my own theory, which is based on experience. I've said that it's highly likely that alongside the argument between, let's call them the realists and the neocons over whether or not to continue this investment to Ukraine, it's quite likely that this has also evolved into a bureaucratic battle, even a turf war to some extent over formation of policy and influence in the White House. And it's also quite likely, because this is the kind of thing that tends to happen over the course of turf wars, that a compromise was reached at some point in the spring, whereby everybody agreed, the realists, the neocons, the Europeans, that Ukraine should be given a further chance with this offensive. And the realists will have been saying to themselves that this is the last chance, this is the last ditch attempt by Ukraine to reverse the war. Once it fails, then we've drawn the line and we can go back to the neocons and say to them, well, look, it's all failed, now we have to stop. The neocons will be saying to themselves, well, we've got the realists to agree to this offensive, and if it does fail, well, we've now established the precedent and we can come back for more. And the Europeans, always arguing with each other, or at least negotiating with each other, and always unwilling to go against the wishes of the Biden administration in this conflict, well, they joined in as well. And in the case of the Germans, they had issues of their own to overcome, with Olaf Scholz skeptical about the supply of the tanks, the Americans insisting, Scholz eventually agreeing to supply the tanks, all on the promise that there would be this offensive. So it's entirely understandable in that kind of context that Milley would be very angry if Zelensky were to come back to him and say, look, this isn't going well, let's call the whole thing off. Because from Milley's point of view, that would risk reopening the whole discussion, provoking the argument, reopening the entire argument about where to go with Ukraine prematurely. He might feel that Zelensky asking for new weapons is another pretext to postpone the offensive again and to land his successor as chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, General Brown, with yet another battle with the neocons, who will then come back and say, well, the offensive can't succeed at the moment because we haven't supplied these weapons and we must now do so. And of course, from Milley's point of view, there must also be worries that if the offensive is indeed called off, then the Europeans will become unhappy. So I don't see it as difficult or surprising that Milley and the entire leadership in Washington are united in wanting this offensive and are insisting that it must be continued. And if this conversation did indeed take place, and if the Americans, including Milley, were angry at what Zelensky was saying, then I would not be surprised. The only thing I would say about this, the thing that makes me a bit guarded about accepting this account, is that I do wonder why Zelensky would be speaking to General Milley. Surely the right person for him to talk to is not General Milley, but President Biden himself. Surely the person who should be talking to General Milley and arguing for the end of the offensive is not President Zelensky, but General Zaluzhny, who is General Milley's opposite number, who is in fact the head of the Ukrainian General Staff. And that, of course, brings us back to the long-standing puzzle and enigma. Where is General Zaluzhny? His forces are now engaged in this very complex and difficult offensive. They are being hammered. Heavy losses are being incurred, losses in men, losses in very valuable equipment. And where is he? Where has he gone? Why is he not visible in the way that he used to be? And asking a further question, What has become of General Budanov, the chief of Ukrainian military intelligence? Where is he also? He was never a person who was at all camera shy, as I remember. On the contrary, he courted publicity, gave any number of comments, said sometimes incredibly provocative things, but he's, to all intents and purposes, disappeared from view. Now, there is lots of rumours that Budanov was killed in the strike on Ukrainian military intelligence headquarters that the Russians conducted some weeks ago. I'm a bit skeptical about this because to the best of my recollection, one of Budanov's most public and extreme rants took place most probably after that attack took place. We don't exactly know when that attack took place, but I got the impression at the time that this happened, that he spoke after the attack, though I'm not absolutely sure. And on balance, I think he is not dead, just as Zaluzhny clearly is not dead. I think in the case of Budanov, he's probably been given an order to shut up, to keep quiet, because frankly, his public conduct, I think, has become a severe embarrassment, perhaps for the Zelensky government, but most importantly for Ukraine's Western allies, above all the United States. As for General Zaluzhny, I'm not going to speculate further about what has happened to him. There's still some people who say that he may have been traumatized by a shell strike. Maybe he was. I wonder myself whether he might be depressed. There's a third view that he's under house arrest for some reason. But anyway, it is mysterious. It could be, as I said before, that he's just has no belief in this offensive and doesn't want to be involved in it. But anyway, there we go. So, interesting report about a conversation between Zelensky and Milley, but I would be careful before accepting its full truth. But anyway, the fact that Ukraine is suffering equipment losses and is urgently demanding replacements of equipment is hardly in dispute anymore. Melnik, former ambassador, now deputy foreign minister, has all but confirmed it with his demands to the Germans for more weapons and more replacements of these Leopard 2s. Well, as for the Leopard 2s and the Bradleys, I said that some of these had been knocked out in what looked to be the grey zone, areas which the Russians might potentially gain control over. And shortly before I started making this program, sure enough, the Russian Ministry of Defense published a video of Russian troops cheerfully walking around these Leopard 2s and Bradleys and the knocked out Leopard 2s and Bradleys, and giving every sign of being, well, not just there with them, but, if you like, having captured them. And the Russian Defense Ministry rather pointedly says that in some cases the Leopard 2s, the engines were still working, they were still they were still mobile, and what happened was that the Ukrainian crews got out and basically ran away. At least that's what the Russian Ministry of Defense says. Now, it's been suggested that the Russians, having got their troops to wander around these Leopard 2s and Bradleys, have now got trophy examples of these vehicles. Perhaps they do. Most probably they do. But I would say that, these are heavy pieces of equipment. It might be the case that the Russians are able to send recovery vehicles to collect them and bring them back to behind the front lines and then put them on a train and drive them to Moscow and have them examined there. I mean, that's certainly a possibility. And of course, if the engine and running gear of some of these tanks is still operating, well, perhaps they can even drive them to their lines. But, as I said, this is heavy equipment. This is a war zone. At the moment, the situation is quiet. Whether the Russians want to commit resources to doing that, to taking these tanks behind their lines and trafficking them to Moscow, well, that's an open question. They might choose to do it, but we'll just have to wait and see. Anyway, even as this, I think it's fair to say, rather sporadic fighting continues on the front lines in southern Ukraine, these piecemeal Ukrainian attacks. Perhaps a bigger attack is coming. As I said, there's been reports that Ukraine is planning some bigger offensive at some point over the next couple of days, which we'll have to wait and see, or hours even. But anyway, even as this fighting goes on, yesterday we saw a very, very significant, very big Russian missile and drone strike across Ukraine. And yesterday, Zelensky's hometown of Kryvyi Rog was targeted. It's a town on the Dnieper River, not very far from the area of the fighting, and it was also other places. There was a major missile strike on Dnipro. The Russians claimed that significant ammunition facilities were destroyed there. And interestingly enough, there were more attacks on Kiev. And again, I get the sense that there was a general shortage of Ukrainian surface-to-air missiles operating, able to defend against these strikes. And over the course of these strikes, I noticed that the Russian Defense Ministry claimed that the radar system of an S-300 missile complex was also destroyed. The Russians continue to hunt that part of Ukraine's air defense system that is left. Now, I noticed that some parts of the British media, especially Reuters, appear to be trying to link, rather subliminally, they're not directly saying it, they appear to be trying to link yesterday's big Russian drone and missile strike to Ukraine's capture of the 4 villages on the ledge. And I'm going to say straight away that that is nonsense. I mean, first of all, as I said, at the time when this missile and drone strike was underway, the Russians appeared to have retaken some ground. But these missile and drone strikes clearly have to be prepared sometime in advance. And I can't imagine that this, frankly, minimal fighting that took place, this well, no, not minimal, but this battle that happened on the ledge could really have been the cause of this big missile and drone strike across Ukraine. Fact is that the Russians are now hammering away at Ukraine every single day almost. This has been the most fierce and intense period of Russia's entire air campaign, at least since the first month of the war in March 2022, when Russian air and missile strikes were also very intense. And I'm going to come back to what John Helmer said about what President Putin said in his recent comments about the Ukrainian offensive. Putin spoke about the fact that it is the military now who are basically running the operation. He gave the clear impression that he is not directly involved any longer in decision making about how the operation itself is going to be conducted, the military side of the operation is going to be conducted. And I think the contrast that is being made is between what was taking place at the start of the war in February, March 2022, and for some period after, when I think Putin had very tight control over what was going on, because at that time he was still seeking a political solution, a political diplomatic compromise. On the very day after Russian troops marched into Ukraine, when President Zelensky said that he was prepared to engage Putin in talks and was prepared to put off the idea of, abandon the idea of NATO membership, I remember President Putin, to what I suspect was the absolute fury of his generals, actually ordered a pause in the Russian advance. He allowed a one-day pause in the Russian advance to allow negotiations to get underway. And throughout February and March, we had this very strange twin-track approach that the Russians were taking. On the one hand, they had their troops camped outside Kiev and other big cities in the north of Ukraine, capturing some of them, engaging the Ukrainians in sporadic and sometimes quite intense battles, even as negotiations took place, got underway, first in Belarus and then in Turkey. And then the negotiations in Turkey, in Istanbul, appeared to have reached a point of success, and Putin, and it can only have been he, took the decision then, or at least endorsed the decision then, to pull Russian troops back from the Kiev area and from other areas in the north of Ukraine. And that was explained and rationalized by many people in all kinds of ways. There's still a widespread belief in the West that the Russians were driven back from Kiev, but but it's always seemed to me that this was a huge exaggeration. There was no real sign that the Russians were really being pushed back from Kiev at that time. And the Russians have always linked this decision to pull their troops back from Kiev to the progress, the apparent progress, and the breakthrough that had taken place in the negotiations in Istanbul. Now, what Putin is now saying is that the days of that are gone. From now on, the military are in unconstrained charge. That doesn't mean that they are at liberty to do anything they want. He's always there. He can always intervene at any time. He remains the Supreme Commander-in-Chief. But essentially, the military have been given a free hand to fight the war as they choose, and they're not going to be constantly restricted in what they do by commands from on high. So we'll see how this now evolves. It does seem to me that the battle in Ukraine is at a pivotal moment. I've discussed in my various programs recently the arguments that are taking place in the West about how to move forward, what to do. hopes that this offensive will succeed. Secretary of State Blinken actually made what was, for him, an actually rather conciliatory speech, though, as always, couched in the most needlessly aggressive and belligerent language of a sort that would infuriate the Russians. But he seemed to say that the purpose of the offensive is to put Ukraine in a position where it can negotiate with the Russians and persuade Putin to return to peace talks, which, of course, it's, again, going back to what happened a year and a bit ago in Istanbul. It was not Putin, of course, who walked away from peace talks. It was the Ukrainians who did, at the urging of the Americans and the British. But anyway, there we go. So even Blinken now seems to be talking about peace talks as the eventual way forward. But, as I said, we have all these dangerous ideas floating around. If the offensive doesn't succeed, give Ukraine security guarantees from the East European members of NATO, send East European troops into Ukraine. I'm starting to get the sense, by the way, that the mood about that has shifted. There is so much opposition to this idea in Eastern Europe that it's been, the tide is turning against it, so to speak. Anyway, people who talk like that, some absolutely frightening and very wild talk of supplying Ukraine with nuclear weapons, which, I mean, I can't even begin to fathom the consequences of that. And I'm astonished that there are people who appear to seriously consider it. Anyway, all of this going on, and at the same time, as I said, some other people, wiser voices perhaps, talking about the need for future negotiations, trying to find some way to discover some kind of off-ramp to get out of this mess that the West is in. Now, there is another possibility, which is that Tobias Ellwood, who is a very well-connected British MP, he is the head, in my recollection, I think he's the head of the Foreign Affairs Committee of the British Parliament, a former military officer, a very passionate hardliner, passionate supporter of Ukraine, very strongly hostile to Russia and all its works, and China as well, by the way. The sort of person whose views are predictable and are as predicted. Anyway, he's now given an interview in which he says that he expects Ukraine to launch some kind of offensive in Donbass over the next few days or weeks. And it could be that coming up against this massive barrier that is confronting Ukraine in the south, with Ukraine making no progress in these attacks, aware that even attempts to penetrate the grey zone are running into all sorts of problems, and that the really heavy lifting of breaking through these enormous Russian fortifications lies ahead, and worried already about the heavy losses and the heavy attrition of the troops. Well, it could well be that what Tobias Ellwood is saying is based on inside information, and that Ukraine is indeed thinking of reorienting its offensive, reallocating its troops, trying to attack in other places. And obviously in Donbass would be one place, and there's been some suggestions that the Ukrainians might even try to recapture Bakhmut, that the loss of Bakhmut was such a severe blow. It's still not, by the way, fully acknowledged, that an attack on Bakhmut, an attempt to recapture Bakhmut, is what the Ukrainians might decide to do. Well, as to that, we will have to wait and see. What I will say about an attack on Bakhmut is that even if they do recapture Bakhmut, they will suffer very severe losses in the process, and of course, it will not change the outcome of the war. It will, in fact, play into the attrition strategy that General Surovikin outlined some months ago, because, of course, as Yevgeny Prigozhin has repeatedly said, the original purpose of the Battle of Bakhmut, from a Russian point of view, was not even to capture Bakhmut. It was to use Bakhmut as a place, a location to grind down the Ukrainian army, to cause it to experience heavy, irreplaceable losses, and to buy the Russians time to build up their great fortified lines across the entire line of conflict. So Ukraine attempting to recapture Bakhmut, if they even do recapture Bakhmut, it seems to me plays into that strategy, because they would suffer extremely heavy losses doing so to recover a town which they controlled just a few weeks ago, compounding the enormous losses that they have suffered already. And it wouldn't achieve any great breakthrough, because, as Brian Beletic at the New Atlas pointed out some months ago, in fact, you actually look at the maps which show you the great Russian fortified lines, the ones that Surovikin sponsored and built. In the Donbass, they are to the west of Bakhmut. They are between Bakhmut and Popasnaya. So that is, in Donbass, the big Russian line of defense. So yes, capture Bakhmut, suffer enormous losses doing so, cause you heavy attrition. You can get, however, some good bits of publicity in the Western media. You might be able to get some more words of support. It won't change the ultimate situation on the ground, but, well, who's to say? It might be what the Ukrainians will do. For the moment, I should say that all of the attacks that Ukraine has been launching in the Bakhmut area, so far as I can see, have without exception been repelled. So there's not been any Ukrainian progress there. They may be able to capture the odd field from time to time, but up to this point, so far, they've not managed to capture or recapture any important place around Bakhmut, and they're experiencing more losses in men and equipment by even making these attacks. But anyway, we will see what the Ukrainians do. So, I think we are in a pivotal place, because it seems to me that it all now converges on Vilnius, on what happens there when NATO meets in July. If there is no visible progress in Ukraine's offensive, there will be, I suspect, a great deal of recrimination behind the scenes, argument about what to do, demands from the neocons for more escalation, concerns from the realists about where that might lead, and growing uncertainty and doubt about where to go next. Conversely, if Ukraine has made some progress, it could even be that that will intensify the arguments. Provided Ukraine doesn't make any big breakthroughs, I can see that more progress will encourage the neocons again to demand even more, and this time they might actually get some traction. They might be able to say, look, the Ukrainians are making progress on the battlefields. Let's reinforce them. Let's give them fighter jets and all that. And now, and they can then build on their successes, and that will enable us to achieve some kind of breakthrough in this war. Or, of course, if the offensive has completely collapsed, that will cause arguments and recriminations of an entirely different kind as well. I would like to briefly touch on again, as my last point, on Secretary Blinken's comments. There is a bizarre fallacy here, and here once again you can see the evidence of the arguments between the realists and the neocons that are raging in Washington. The realists, Mr. Charap specifically, at the RAND Corporation, the Council of Foreign Relations, in reports he's published or co-written for the RAND Corporation, in his most recent article in Foreign Affairs, he's pointed out that, look, even if you succeed in what you say is your intention, even if you are able to drive Russia out of every millimeter of territory that Ukraine claims, which is something, I think, which no one seriously expects anymore, why do you assume that that is going to force the Russians to the negotiating table? Why assume that? After all, Russia's overall power remains intact, their military is building up, their military industries are humming. All it would most probably do is induce the Russians to carry out a further mobilization and renew the attack again. In fact, in that kind of situation, that's almost certainly what Vladimir Putin would be obliged to do. And of course, if you're not able to drive the Russians out of every millimeter of territory, if they are able to retain Crimea, even those areas of Donbass that were under the control of the two republics before February 2022, well, they would have even less reason in that case to sit down and negotiate. And of course, if you aren't able to make any significant breakthroughs anywhere at all, well, the Russians have even less incentive to negotiate still. And that's what Mr. Charap is saying, whereas Mr. Blinken seems to be saying something completely different. He is saying we have to gain ground in order to force the Russians to the negotiating table. It seems to me that Mr. Blinken is making the same mistake that Mr. Putin made, that Vladimir Putin made at the start of the war. Mr. Putin assumed that if he could move his army to the gates of Kiev, he would force the Ukrainians to talk, which of course they did, and he would force the Ukrainians to compromise, which of course they didn't. He miscalculated, and it came back to haunt him, because he then had to commit Russia to a long war, which perhaps is turning out better for him than he might have expected, but that's another story. Well, Blinken, it seems to me, is making exactly the same mistake. He is assuming that if you win some territory on the battlefields against the Russians will go away and say to themselves, well, this isn't working. Let's instead give up and sit down and negotiate and agree to whatever terms Blinken and company are kind enough to grant us. I think that Charap is far more realistic about this than Blinken is. I think that far from pushing the Russians into negotiations, which would really amount to negotiations for some sort of capitulation. I think what the Russians will do, if there's any kind of Ukrainian advance at all, is solidify even further and redouble their determination to see the war through. That certainly is Charup's view. That's the view of the Rand Corporation, as I presume. That, I suspect, is also the view of the US military, uniformed military. And I think that's the Russian view. And of course, if we go back to the points that I made in my previous programs, the Russians surely are going to be reinforced in that view by what they see about the situation of the United States. They're able to read articles in Politico and the Rand Corporation studies and in Foreign Affairs, just as I can. They can pick up all of these reports about the depletion of US arsenals and European arsenals. They probably have an awful lot more information about this than I certainly do, about the true rates of ammunition production in Europe, about the critical state of US military preparedness in the Pacific. And they will know that the Pentagon is pushing for a quick conclusion to the war. So the Russians can say to themselves, well, provided we keep going, sooner or later we will win, because as the United States has repeatedly shown in previous wars, in Vietnam, in Iraq, in Afghanistan, and now with us, the United States, with its global commitments, especially now that it is involved in an existential confrontation with China in the Pacific, just doesn't have the staying power to keep going in Ukraine indefinitely, whereas, of course, we do. So I think that's probably the Russian calculation, and I think it shows again that Blinken is wrong and Charup is right. But of course, we see again further public evidence here about how the neocons and the realists argue. People like Charup want negotiations as soon as possible. They want a clear end game. They are not prepared to stake the future of negotiations on the outcome of Ukraine's offensive, and they're less concerned, to say it straightforwardly, about achieving any kind of maximalist objectives in Ukraine than they are in getting out of Ukraine and bringing this festering sore to an end, this festering conflict to an end. Whereas for the neocons, the outcome of the war remains all important. They still want to achieve at least some of their objectives in this conflict. Certainly they want to humiliate Russia in some way, and for them, therefore, the offensive and the continuation of the war until something of that is achieved, that remains the priority. Well, as I said, in time, in these kind of arguments, the realists tend to prevail, but it could take time, and we will just have to wait and see. Now, I'm going to finish with the point that Larry Johnson made in Sonar 21, his blog. He said that it is a fundamental fallacy to think that this war, if the Ukrainian offensive fails, is going to result in some long stalemate. says that Ukraine is running out of men, machines, ammunition. The West lacks the ability to replace these. It's much more likely that sometime in 2023, 2024, the Russians will prevail. And I agree. And I think the Russians know it. And I think that is why they're fighting the way they are, waiting to see this Ukrainian offensive off. Might take them some weeks, perhaps months. But when it's over, they will go back on the offensive where they want to go, and they will steadily, incrementally push forward until their objectives are achieved. I think the Russians have a much more realistic understanding of the state of this conflict than Secretary Blinken self-evidently does. Anyway, that's me for today. More from me soon. Just to remind you again, you can find all our programs on our various platforms: Locals, Rumble, BitChute, ODYSEE, Rockfin and Telegram. By the way, just to say, if people want to go to Locals, I know there's been some people feel rather a lot of advertisements on YouTube videos. Well, none on Locals, but you can subscribe to the channel, participate in live streams, communicate, publish your own information on our page, our Locals page, become an active member of our community if you wish. But anyway, look, just to repeat again: Locals, Rumble, BitChute, ODYSEE, Rockfin and Telegram. You can also support our work via Patreon and Subscribestar, links under this video. You can also go to our shop and buy yourself the amazing things that you will find there: our magic mugs, our hats, our hoodies, our t-shirts, our sweatshirts, all our great things. And last but not least, if you've liked this video, please remember to tick the like button and to check your subscription to this channel. Thank you for joining me again today. More from me soon.